Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to give my review of WCW Sold Out 1997. Starting off the evening, we're going to go to our first match of the night. It is Chris Jericho versus Masahiro Chono. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Jericho and Chono, with Chono keeping the pace of the match. Jericho ends up hitting a step-up enziguri on Chono. Jericho then hits a lion salt on Chono in the middle of the ring. Chono then gets up, throws Jericho off the top rope through a table on the outside, and Chono ultimately hits the finish on Jericho, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Masahiro Chono. Hats off to Masahiro Chono for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Hugh Morris versus Bubba Rogers. I thought this was an awful match. Back and forth matchup between Morris and Rogers, with Morris keeping the pace of the match. Rogers ends up hitting Morris with a chain. Morris then hits a moonsault off the top rope on Rogers, but Rogers ultimately hits Morris with a motorcycle, and your winner of the match is Bubba Rogers. Hats off to Bubba Rogers for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Jeff Jarrett versus Wall Street. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Jarrett and Wall Street, with Jarrett keeping the pace of the match. Jarrett then applies a figure 4 leg lock on Wall Street, but the hold is broken. McMichael then gets involved in this match by hitting Wall Street with a briefcase. Jarrett then goes for the cover, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Jeff Jarrett. Hats off to Jeff Jarrett for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Scotty Riggs versus Buff Bagwell. I thought this was an okay matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between Riggs and Bagwell, with Riggs keeping the pace of the match. But Bagwell ultimately hits his signature blockbuster on Scotty Riggs, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match is Buff Bagwell. Hats off to Buff Bagwell for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Scott Norton versus DDP. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Norton and DDP, with Norton keeping the pace of the match. DDP ultimately hits a flapjack on Scott Norton, but this match ultimately ends in a no contest. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Tag Team Championships. It is Scott Hall and Kevin Nash versus the Steiner Brothers. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with Nash and Hall keeping the pace of the match. Hall ends up hitting a fall-away slam. Rick Steiner then hits a power slam on Nash. Hall then hits a razor's edge on Scott Steiner. Rick then ultimately lands a bulldog on Scott Hall, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match, and at that time new WCW Tag Team Champions, are the Steiner Brothers. Hats off to the Steiner Brothers for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Eddie Guerrero versus Syxx for the WCW United States Championship in a ladder match. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Guerrero and Syxx, with Guerrero keeping the pace of the match. Eddie ultimately climbs the ladder, grabs the championship belt, and your winner of the match is Eddie Guerrero. Hats off to Eddie Guerrero for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of WCW Sold Out 1997. It is the Giant versus Hulk Hogan. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between the Giant and Hogan, with Hogan keeping the pace of the match. Hogan then hits a leg drop on the Giant. Giant gets right back up. Giant then hits a choke slam on Hogan. Giant then hits a choke slam on Nick Patrick as well. NWO make their way down to the ring. Giant is hitting choke slams on everyone, and this match ultimately ends in a no contest. Couple things I'm going to say about WCW's Sold Out 1997. Was it a good event? No, it was not a good event whatsoever. And basically how this event went down, if you guys don't know how Sold Out 97 went down, basically what it was pretty much sponsored by the NWO. And what I mean by that is, the entire stage setup for the show was pretty much all NWO based. This was a pure NWO event for WCW at this time. And I think what, the storyline that was going on at that time was that Eric Bischoff and the NWO really wanted to separate themselves from the WCW roster. NWO wanted to be its own private entity, not being, with WCW. So I think Eric Bischoff really wanted to have an event to kind of separate the NWO from the WCW. Now, with that being said, majority of this card had NWO talent versus WCW talent. For example, you had the opening matchup between Chris Jericho and Masahiro Chono. Jericho, at the time, was a WCW guy. He was a WCW talent. Chono, even though he worked with WCW, he was more of an NWO guy. And majority, when the wrestlers came out to the ring, the NWO guys got their theme music. They all got, the NWO music. A lot of the WCW guys didn't. And basically what it was that, whoever was doing the announcements for the matches, they were kind of making fun of the guys that were from WCW. And throughout the entire duration of this card, there was no Bobby Heenan, there was no Tony Schiavone, there was no Dusty Rhodes on commentary. Basically what we got was a play-by-play and commentary team of Eric Bischoff and Ted DiBiase. And, that alone was tragic. I mean, the commentary for these matches were awful. It didn't seem like Ted, DiBiase really knew what he was doing on commentary. And Eric Bischoff was trying to do his best to sell the event the best way that he can. Now, like I said, I don't know how this event was really sold out. I mean, I'm guessing it was sold out due to the fact of Hall and Nash and Hogan being on this card. But other than that, man, it was a very lackadaisical card. I think it was one of the worst events WCW put together, in my honest opinion. And it really didn't do anything, I think, at that time for WCW or NWO. It just highlighted the NWO, talent. But storyline-wise, it just really wasn't there. And, with the main event, we got the Giant and the Hogan. And we've seen that match so many times, even in 96, that it just, that well has run dry between the Giant and Hogan. And I felt like they had nobody else to put up against Hogan. And then we get to the following pay-per-view after Sold Out, which I believe is Super Brawl, which would be Hogan versus Piper for the championship. I don't understand why we couldn't have Piper versus Hogan at Sold Out in 97, rather than, the following pay-per-view for Super Brawl. So that was my biggest thing. I mean, the card itself, like I said, man, it was just lackluster. I mean, Hugh Morris versus Bubba Rogers, it was very lackluster. Jarrett versus Wall Street, again, lackluster. The best match, I think, on this card, to me, was Nash Hall versus the Steiners and Eddie Guerrero versus Syxx was the two top matches of this card. Other than that, it was very lackadaisical, man, really. It was definitely one of those pay-per-views that was definitely not needed at that time, or, just in general. It just really wasn't needed. And like I stated earlier, pretty much what I think Bischoff was trying to do was trying to separate what WCW had and make NWO its own private entity and its own, promotion. And I just think it really wasn't working at that time. And, again, not taking anything away from Eric Bischoff. I mean, what he did for WCW, competing against Monday Night Raw for, all that time and beating them in the ratings, you got to give credit where credit's due. But this was definitely one of those events that just was not needed at all. But like I do with every single one of these pay-per-views, I always give these pay-per-views a rating from 1 out of 10. I'm going to have to give WCW Sold Out 1997 a solid rating of a 3 at best, man. Like I said, very lackadaisical card. It wasn't the best, sold out event I've seen for WCW. This was very lackluster. The card was very weak. And I think WCW at that time could have done a hell of a lot better than what they did for Sold Out 1997. So I'm going to have to give Sold Out 1997 a solid 3 at best. But this is my review of WCW Sold Out 1997. I hope you guys are out there staying safe. Be careful. And remember, stay classic. Peace.